I'm going to start with a piece of news, local news from Quebec. Last week, the Institut de Québec released a report that made all the major papers here, showing that 51% of Quebec boys graduate from high school. That means 49% drop out. That figure is about 67% for girls. And many of these boys have special needs. About 70% of them have learning disabilities of some kind. And if they do have learning disabilities, only 30% of those boys graduate. Making the leap from childhood to adulthood, StatsCan tells us that these high school dropouts have difficulty finding jobs. And of course, it stands to reason that people who have difficulty finding meaningful work are more likely to get depressed, as Dan talked about so meaningfully. A quarter of them are chronically unemployed. Now, this is a scenario that was very familiar to me as a child psychologist. Every day for 25 years, I'd open my waiting room door and I'd be faced with boys, Daniels and Davids and Joshua's, and only the rare Julia and Amber. And the questions were, why isn't my child speaking, reading by now, paying attention, following instructions in the classroom? Why is he more interested in the bus schedule than in making friends in the schoolyard? So I spent the first half of my professional life with troubled boys. Now, the reason for this is that there's a gender divide that starts in childhood. So, as we learned from Dan, there's some very specific aspects to male depression, for example. Some of this gender divide starts very early. For example, attention deficit disorder is twice as common in males as in females. Conduct disorder, this is a behavior-related disorder, is 3 times as common among males as females. Language disorders are 4 times as common among males as females, and autistic spectrum disorders are 8 times as common. So, as a personal comment, when I was expecting my first child, I thought, let it not be a boy, because I knew the data and I knew the risks. Boys are simply much more vulnerable right from the start. And of course, as we've heard, adult males are more vulnerable too. They have much more chronic disease, more infections, more social isolation. And there are biological elements to this that are undeniable. For example, we have a big problem here in many Western democracies with hospital-based infections like MRSA and C. difficile, but few people know that 70% of the people who die from these infections are male, because there is a dose-response relationship between your testosterone level and your vulnerability to these hospital-based infections. People who are prisoners, 10 times as many of them are male than female. Many of us say, it's a patriarchy, but I think few women would want to inherit some of these very male problems. Those who are killed at work, 9 times as many of them are men. The ratio is 9 to 1. People with spinal cord injuries, most of these are young men. By the way, 8 times as common among men as women, and these are usually young men who dive into swimming pools that have no water in them, or jump off cliffs into shallow water where there's rocks, or have motorcycle accidents, and they're paralyzed for life, or some of them die. As we heard, suicides are much more common among men, even though, as we heard from Dan, depression is more common among women. But perhaps we haven't been diagnosing it correctly. Maybe there isn't that gender imbalance. Maybe it in fact looks different. And accidents, 2 times as common among men as women. And by the way, I don't know if I'm quite a news hound, and I'm sure you heard the news recently that the number of accidents, vehicle accidents, has gone up in Quebec, and most of the time the drivers are male. So all of this added together means that there's a huge gender gap in life expectancy. Men are more vulnerable biologically, and they're more vulnerable behaviorally, and it adds up to about a 5 to 8 year gender gap in lifespan. And actually, that gender gap is what inspired my second book, to find out what are the social aspects of that. Now, looking at girls, right from the get-go, they're much stronger. They're heavier than boys are at birth, which is research by Michael Kramer, who is actually another Montrealer. He's a retired epidemiologist from Montreal. When you look at the survival rate of premature babies, almost 2 times as many girls survive as boys do. Crib deaths are increasing, but fewer of these crib deaths are little girls. And finally, a very Canadian story. We have an area of Canada called, we call it Chemical Valley, because the petrochemical industry has altered the landscape in Sarnia, which is northern Ontario. And in Sarnia, because of environmental issues, it has halved the number of male births. Now, what does this actually mean? It means no hockey teams for boys. They don't have enough boys for hockey teams. When girls grow up, they have to move away to get married because there aren't as many boys to marry. And so the hazards of environmental pollution even affect boys differently than they affect girls. So we just can't pretend that they are clones of each other. Even from early days, boys are much more vulnerable. When you look at girls in comparison, their educational strengths are different very early. They speak earlier, talk faster, and have a larger vocabulary on average. And this is research led by Shaywitz, Halpern, and Plowman, Roger Pullman. They tend to have an early empathy advantage or a social advantage over boys, which any of you who've been into early childhood classrooms, either daycares, nursery schools, kindergartens, early childhood years, you can see it. This is research by Eisenberg, Baron Cohen, among others, Shelley Taylor. They tend to have stronger reading, spelling, writing in all of the OECD countries, and are half as likely to repeat a grade as boys are. And in the OECD countries, they have standardized educational tests called the PISA tests. So it's very easy to get kind of European-wide statistics. And the flavor of the month, self-discipline or grit, is notably more powerful, more stronger among girls than boys. And in fact, there was a new piece of research that showed that it was just published last month, showing that teachers are more likely to look at boys' playfulness as being obstreperous and difficult and unacceptable, whereas when girls are being playful, it's considered to be just fine and normal behavior. And of course, something that's extremely important and related to where I started is that since the barriers came down in the 60s and 70s, female college students have increased by 320%. And so that in many classes now, we have a matriarchy in the university, and many universities are now deploying reverse discrimination in order to bring up their cohort of boys. And the boys have increased too, but only half that, about 170% since the 70s. So the question is why, and that's a very complicated question. There's no one simple answer. It's a combination of answers. I would say, as far as we know, prenatal hormones play a big role in shaping the brain and shaping not only the brain architecture, but how the boys and girls will develop. So there are genetic differences, not only in brain architecture, which we'll get to, but also in neural connectivity. There's more male variability, or more extreme males, which I will explain shortly. Lifelong learning exaggerates these differences. So even if you think about yourselves and you think about the strengths that you have right at the beginning, you tend to do those things more and get better at them because it's more rewarding. So you tend to practice things that you're already a little bit better at. And that exaggerates the gender differences that we see. And finally, social structures really reflect the male norm. In other words, just as, for example, the ways of diagnosing depression may have reflected the female norm, many of our social structures, especially in the workplace, reflect the male norm and the male lifespan. So all of these combined form some of the sex differences that we see. But just briefly, let's just take a look at some of the neural differences in terms of brain structure. Men tend to have more hemispheric lopsidedness, meaning that their two hemispheres look more different than they do among women. Their brains tend to be proportionally heavier, meaning that even though men tend to be heavier, their brains tend to be heavier too. They tend to process strong emotions in the right hemisphere. And this is research by Richard Hare at University of California, Irvine, shows that smart males, very intelligent males, tend to have more gray matter in the posterior areas of their brain, in the sensory areas, and that looks really different from women, where they tend to have more hemispheric balance. Why would this matter? It doesn't really matter unless you have a stroke. Okay? If you have a stroke, and if you have more hemispheric balance, you're more likely to recover your language, for example. But if you have more lopsidedness, if an area is knocked out by damage or by a lesion, it's much more difficult to recover and almost impossible. Women have much higher cell density and much greater connectivity. So going back a few decades, Sandra Whittleson, who was a neuroscientist, also a McGill graduate, got herself into a lot of trouble when she discovered that men's brains were not only bigger but heavier. And everybody thought that meant that they were better. But no, they're not better. There's much more denser connections in the female brain, even though male brains are heavier. Women tend to process strong emotions in the left hemisphere as opposed to the right hemisphere. And very intelligent women tend to have more gray and more white matter in the frontal areas of their brain as opposed to the posterior areas of their brain. So what it looks like, okay, if you can take a look at this slide, is that you see that the men, you see the orange areas, these are the areas that have the greatest amount of efficiency when men are solving difficult intellectual problems. And you can see that in women, it's right at the front. So both of them can solve these problems. They solve them differently and using different parts of the brain. So the concept of efficiency looks different. And as girls age, there's increasing organization in the right hemisphere. As boys age, there's increasing organization in the left hemisphere. So they start off more different and they start to get gradually more similar, but there's still marked differences. And it's kind of like two software programs that are running at different speeds and to solve different problems. And of course, the question is why. By the way, my view is social science is really good at describing what is and is not so great at solving the why question. So when we talk about why, usually there are multiple reasons, as I've explained, that we've gone through them, and I'm going to go through them quickly. But when all of these are taken together, it's easy to just look at one as the major factor, or people will often get into a useless debate about nature versus nurture, which is, I would say, not only futile, but incorrect. It can't be one or the other, it has to be both. Let's look at the differences in male extremes. So men and women are very similar on average. So if you look at between those two dotted lines, if one distribution is male and one distribution is female, and if you look between the two dotted lines, there isn't much difference between them. So it means that for the average person, we're pretty alike, men and women. Where there are huge differences is not under the highest area of the bell or under the highest part of the distribution, where most of us are, but right at the tails. So as you move towards the tails, that's where the differences get much larger, as you can see by this magnification. And that's where we see really huge sex differences at the tails. And this is why, for example, I'll explain it with height. And, at 5'10" or 1.7 meters, the male-female ratio is about 30 to 1. So 30 men who are 1.7 meters to 1 woman. And actually, this was illustrated to me very personally. I was at a wedding this weekend, and the woman who was getting married was 6 feet tall. So, and her father made a little speech and said, you know, it's really nice that Andrea is marrying Jonathan because for once she doesn't have to look down at her date, she can look up. Okay, because she finally met a man who was taller than she was, because at 6 feet tall, there are 2,000 men to 1 woman. Mm-hmm. And as you move along the distribution, this fellow here that you're looking at is Robert Wadlow. He's 8 feet 11 inches or 2.7 meters. There are no women who are that tall. So as you move more and more extreme towards the tails, there are fewer and fewer females. And he's standing here beside his brother, who is average height. And so these male extremes have prompted the following observations by scientists and social critics, that there are more idiots, male idiots, and more male geniuses. You know, often people focus on, oh, there are so many more male Nobel Prize winners, but actually there are more struggling males at the other end of the spectrum as well. And that's James Wilson, who's a political scientist, more dumbbells and more Nobels, Helena Cronin, who's an anthropologist and a philosopher, and Camille Paglia, never one to shy from controversy, no female Mozart because there's no female Jack the Ripper. Okay, so the reason why I'm talking about this is to say that it's not really always a barrel of laughs to be at the extreme end of the distribution. And certainly you see a higher level of aggression, single-mindedness, competitiveness, risk-taking, and some of these traits can get you into trouble at the extremes. So let's look at some examples of male extremes. William the Conqueror, who was the King of England around the year 1000. He was responsible for the deaths of about 7,000 people at the Battle of Hastings. He starved thousands of people to death, including women and children, to suppress uprisings. He was a complete megalomaniac, so that's why he left a lot of monuments behind, and he died at the very young age of 59 when he fell off his horse. Moulay Ismail the Bloodthirsty, another male extreme, a warrior king in the Moroccan Alawite dynasty in the 1600s. He ordered devastating massacres. Okay, so, and he didn't discriminate who he was killing. He kept 25,000 slaves, and he fathered 888 children with multiple wives. Right?
Oh, with multiple wives.
Yeah. But getting back to a kind of male characteristic that many of us see in our daily lives, the physicist Henry Cavendish, who was described as having a striking literalness of mind, very single-minded, had a passion for calculation, very stubbornly held ideas, had used very rigorously exact language in non-scientific contexts, and had a virtual incomprehension of social behaviors and human relationships. So some of us can see a continuum, like this is the extreme, but some, for example, Simon Baron-Cohen has postulated that this is a male extreme that gets kind of more diluted as you move towards the center of the distribution. Oh, we have a tiny, tiny little, there we go. If we look at something like empathy, we actually see that males and females diverge at the extremes, more similar at the center, but in the other direction. So as you move towards the extremes are more likely to be women than men. But in the middle, where most of us are, we're very similar to each other. Why is that? Some of us think that there is a strong relationship to oxytocin, which is a neuropeptide that developed among mammals, of which we are one, and women tend to have many more oxytocin receptors and secrete much more oxytocin. It surges during sex, during labor, breastfeeding, during cuddling, and nurturing. So Shelley Taylor was a psychologist who was quite famous in discovering that there is a release of oxytocin when you reach out and help people. So when you reach out, she called that the tend and befriend instinct, and that it benefits not just the person being helped, but the person offering the help. And those women who are they're often women who do it, get a little kind of jolt of dopamine. It makes them feel good. It's pleasurable. So their maternal neural pathways are rife with oxytocin receptors, which promotes problem solving. It reduces pain and stress and induces a sense of euphoria. And it prompts social activity. It makes us want to reach out to others. It doesn't mean that men don't have it. 1 minute left. We do know that blasting men with oxytocin makes them trust more, makes them better able to read emotion in others, makes them better able to trust others, reduces their inhibitions, and is a social enabler. So, finally, we do know that women's social networks are linked to reduced cognitive decline, less chronic disease, greater happiness at work, even though, as they say, on average, women earn less, but they tend to be happier. Economists call that the gender paradox, and a longer lifespan. So I'd like to actually close here and offer the idea that, until now, we have said that men have been the model for women to emulate. And I'm starting to wonder in some areas whether the tables should be turned in order to protect men's health and men's mental health. So I'll stop here. Thank you.